At 78, Don Henley stands just off stage listening to the sound of a crowd that has grown older with him, his posture calm, his expression unreadable, a man who has spent decades letting songs speak while he watched the world change around them. And in this suspended moment before the lights rise, there is no explanation, no confession, only the weight of memory, the distance traveled, and the sense that something unspoken has followed him from the beginning and is still present now. Don Henley's earliest years unfolded in Gilmer, Texas, a place defined not by spectacle but by rhythm, where days moved slowly enough for observation to become a habit and where the surrounding landscape quietly instructed him in patience, restraint, and attention, as pine forests stretched outward and the nearby wetlands of East Texas offered a living classroom in balance, endurance, and quiet power, shaping a child who learned early that meaning often lives beneath the surface rather than announcing itself loudly. And within this environment, family provided structure and expectation, reinforcing discipline, responsibility, and the value of steady effort, while local radio carried voices from far beyond county lines, blending country, rhythm and blues, gospel, and early rock into a soundtrack that suggested a larger world without demanding immediate escape. And church further deepened this awareness, not merely as a place of worship but as a space where harmonies rose collectively and emotion was expressed through shared sound, teaching Henley how music could carry both reverence and longing at the same time. And as he absorbed these influences, he developed an instinct for narrative and tone, learning to listen before speaking and to observe before acting, habits that would later define his songwriting and leadership. And long before ambition pushed him toward distant stages, the wetlands and back roads of Texas instilled a worldview rooted in preservation, memory, and moral tension, embedding in him a lifelong sensitivity to place, consequence, and continuity, so that even as fame eventually carried him far from Gilmer, the lessons of water, land, and quiet community remained present, shaping not only how he wrote songs but how he understood responsibility, legacy, and the cost of movement away from home. Leaving Gilmer was not an act of rebellion or dramatic escape but a measured separation from certainty, a choice shaped by restlessness rather than dissatisfaction, as Don Henley stepped away from a life where expectations were clear and futures were largely pre-written, trading familiar faces, steady routines, and the quiet reassurance of belonging for the uncertainty of distance and the promise of possibility. And the road west carried more doubt than confidence, unfolding mile by mile as Texas gave way to unfamiliar landscapes and the idea of Los Angeles transformed from abstraction into reality, a city that did not welcome gently or explain itself, but instead demanded resilience, adaptability, and an almost immediate willingness to be overlooked. And within this cultural shock, Henley encountered a pace and intensity unlike anything he had known, where ambition crowded every room, talent was abundant, and failure arrived without ceremony, forcing him to confront his own limitations while sharpening his resolve, as cramped apartments, long rehearsals, and modest opportunities replaced the comfort of predictability. And yet it was precisely this friction that hardened his ambition, teaching him that discipline mattered as much as inspiration and that survival required patience rather than urgency, as he learned to observe the mechanics of the industry, the unspoken hierarchies, and the subtle negotiations that determined who advanced and who disappeared. And through this process, distance from home transformed nostalgia into motivation, turning memory into fuel rather than anchor. And by enduring isolation, competition, and the slow erosion of certainty, he began to understand that success would not arrive through talent alone but through endurance, self-control, and an ability to navigate complexity without losing direction, marking the moment when the quiet observer from Texas became an artist prepared to withstand the demands of a larger world, while carrying the values of his origins silently within him. Los Angeles in the early 70s was crowded with talented drifters chasing a sound that could survive both the radio and the road, and it was within this restless scene that Don Henley found himself aligning with musicians whose ambitions matched his own, first as a sideman and then as a co-architect of something larger, as shared rehearsals, tentative gigs, and late-night conversations slowly hardened into a band identity built on harmony, discipline, and an unspoken agreement that success would require sacrifice. And even in those earliest days there was a duality forming, warm melodies paired with sharp instincts, camaraderie laced with control, that would become the Eagles' defining strength and their most persistent source of tension. As the band's profile rose, Henley's role shifted from participant to guardian of direction, learning quickly that survival in a successful group depended not only on talent but on authorship, ownership, and the ability to say no. And through writing sessions, studio debates, and internal power struggles, he refined a leadership style that valued structure over chaos and long-term vision over short-term ease, sometimes at the cost of friendships, but always in service of a sound he believed should reflect discipline, narrative clarity, and emotional restraint, marking the moment when idealism gave way to responsibility and when art became inseparable from control. When the band entered the studio to work on what would become their most enduring song, none of them could have predicted how deeply it would embed itself into cultural memory. Yet from its opening notes, the track carried a tension that mirrored the band's own condition, blending beauty with unease and freedom with confinement. And as Henley shaped the lyrics with precision and ambiguity, he created not a message but a reflection, one that listeners would project their own meanings onto for decades, transforming a single recording into a symbol of excess, loss, illusion, and permanence, and in doing so locking the Eagles, and Henley himself, into a legacy that would never stop asking questions even when answers were deliberately withheld. Success arrived not as relief but as pressure, and by the late 70s the Eagles were no longer simply a band but a machine expected to generate perfection on demand, with endless touring, studio deadlines, and a public appetite that never cooled, and inside that pressure cooker personal differences hardened into rival philosophies about leadership, credit, and direction, while fatigue stripped away patience and turned minor disagreements into defining conflicts, leaving Henley caught between protecting the integrity of the work and navigating personalities that were fraying under constant scrutiny. And as excess became normalized and rest became rare, the dream that had once promised freedom began to resemble confinement, a contradiction that seeped into performances, rehearsals, and private conversations until the band's internal fractures could no longer be hidden. When the Eagles came apart, the sudden quiet that followed was more unsettling than the noise that had defined the years before. And for Don Henley, the end of the band did not feel like liberation but like exposure, as if the structure that had both supported and constrained him had vanished overnight, leaving him alone with expectations that no longer belonged to a collective but rested entirely on his name, his voice, and his judgment. And the early days of this transition were marked less by confidence than by hesitation, as studios that once felt collaborative now felt revealing, every lyric scrutinized not as part of a shared identity but as a personal statement, and every creative decision carried the weight of proving that his artistic presence could survive without the familiar harmonies and internal checks of the group, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the success of the past might not translate cleanly into the future. And yet within this uncertainty there was also a slow, deliberate recalibration, as Henley resisted the impulse to rush back into visibility, choosing instead to sit with silence, to listen more carefully to his instincts, and to rebuild his creative process from the inside out, learning how to lead without consensus and how to trust collaborators without surrendering authorship, while navigating the emotional residue of the breakup, where unresolved tensions and lingering loyalties complicated forward movement. And as time passed, this period of restraint became formative rather than paralyzing, sharpening his sense of identity and clarifying the values he wanted his solo work to reflect, emphasizing narrative clarity, emotional honesty, and controlled intensity over excess or spectacle, and through gradual experimentation, careful selection of material, and an insistence on quality over speed, Henley began to reclaim momentum on his own terms, discovering that independence demanded greater vulnerability than group success ever had, but also offered a deeper alignment between intention and outcome, marking the beginning of a solo path defined not by the absence of the Eagles, but by the quiet assertion that his voice could stand alone, measured, deliberate, and fully accountable to itself. The arrival of a new decade brought a new visual language to music, and Henley understood that survival depended on evolution rather than nostalgia, embracing contemporary production, cinematic imagery, and a more introspective tone that reflected adulthood rather than youthful rebellion. And when his work found resonance with a generation navigating its own transitions, the success confirmed that reinvention did not require abandoning identity, only refining it, as songs about memory, regret, and fleeting connection found power precisely because they resisted excess and spectacle, allowing Henley to reassert himself not as a relic of a past era but as a voice capable of translating personal reflection into universal experience within a rapidly changing cultural landscape. With renewed visibility came a growing willingness to speak beyond music, and Henley's public statements on cultural and political issues reflected a belief that silence carried its own consequences. Yet this candor invited backlash from audiences who preferred their icons uncomplicated and unopinionated, placing him at the center of debates that blurred the line between artist and advocate. And while criticism intensified and alliances shifted, he remained consistent in the view that success brought responsibility rather than retreat, accepting that conviction often narrows approval, and in doing so reinforcing a public identity defined not by universal acceptance but by the refusal to separate art from conscience, even when that choice complicated his relationship with fans and the industry alike. As the years accumulated, Henley's focus widened beyond charts and stages toward preservation, driven by the belief that success without stewardship was hollow, and this impulse expressed itself through advocacy for artists' rights, environmental protection, and cultural memory. As he invested time and influence into defending songwriting ownership in an era of rapid technological change, while also committing himself to safeguarding landscapes that had shaped his earliest sense of wonder, seeing in both music and nature a shared vulnerability to exploitation. And while critics sometimes framed this vigilance as control, Henley viewed it as continuity, a refusal to let short-term profit erase long-term meaning, revealing a philosophy rooted in responsibility rather than nostalgia, and a conviction that legacy is not something declared at the end of a career but something actively maintained along the way. When the Eagles eventually returned to the stage together, the reunion was not fueled by romantic longing but by practical clarity, shaped by lessons learned the hard way and governed by firm boundaries that replaced youthful idealism with contractual precision. and though the performances rekindled harmonies that still carried emotional power, the atmosphere behind the scenes reflected maturity rather than intimacy. As mutual respect coexisted with emotional distance, and Henley approached the revival not as a resurrection of the past but as a controlled presentation of it, determined to honor the music without reopening wounds that time had merely covered, proving that reconciliation does not always require closeness, only agreement. As live music evolved into a global enterprise driven by scale, data, and branding, Henley found himself operating within an industry that treated memory as currency, where audiences sought reassurance in familiar songs and promoters engineered experiences designed to feel timeless. And rather than resisting this shift, as the urgency of constant reinvention faded, Henley entered a phase defined less by visibility and more by intention, releasing work that did not chase trends or dominate airwaves but instead rewarded patience, reflection, and emotional attentiveness. Albums shaped by experience rather than ambition and written with the understanding that subtlety can carry more weight than volume. And within these songs he allowed space for restraint, acknowledging that not every truth needs to announce itself loudly to be felt, as themes of responsibility, regret, endurance, and guarded hope replaced the sharp edges of earlier eras, revealing an artist who had learned that maturity in music often means trusting listeners to meet the work halfway. And though these records arrived quietly, they stood as some of his most honest statements, offering a portrait of a songwriter no longer competing with his past but conversing with it. Longevity invites scrutiny, and with decades of visibility came moments when Henley's words, decisions, or principles collided with changing cultural expectations, drawing criticism that ranged from thoughtful disagreement to outright misinterpretation. And rather than retreat, he often chose to engage, defending positions that he believed were rooted in fairness, authorship, and accountability, even when such defenses complicated his public image, and these moments exposed the contradictions inherent in being both an artist and an authority, admired for independence yet questioned for rigidity. As Henley navigated the uncomfortable reality that conviction does not age as easily as songs, and that standing still while the world shifts can look indistinguishable from resistance, forcing him to reconcile self-consistency with the inevitability of reinterpretation. Recognition arrived steadily, accumulating in the form of awards, inductions, and formal acknowledgments that attempted to summarize decades of cultural impact into plaques and ceremonies. Yet for Henley, these honors carried an ambivalence shaped by experience, as validation felt less like discovery and more like confirmation of work already completed. And while public celebrations framed his career as monumental, he remained conscious that such recognition often arrives after the risks have been taken and the consequences absorbed, making accolades less about triumph and more about closure, symbols not of perfection but of endurance. And in accepting them he did so with measured gratitude, aware that legacy is ultimately defined not by institutions but by the private moments when songs continue to matter to people he will never meet. A life spent performing leaves marks that applause cannot erase, and as Henley aged, the physical demands of touring, rehearsing, and recording required recalibration rather than denial, prompting adjustments in pacing, scheduling, and expectation, as he confronted the reality that stamina is finite and that preservation sometimes means refusal. And this awareness reshaped his priorities, shifting emphasis from expansion to sustainability, from proving capability to protecting continuity, and within this recalibration emerged a deeper understanding of discipline, not as force but as care, recognizing that endurance is not measured by how long one can push forward unchanged, but by the wisdom to adapt without surrendering identity, allowing age to refine purpose rather than diminish presence. With the distance that only time provides, Henley's reflections become less about defending decisions and more about understanding them, revisiting moments that were once framed as victories or failures and re-examining them with a clarity that comes from having outlived their immediate consequences, acknowledging missteps without dramatizing them and successes without romanticizing the cost. As memory itself becomes a living thing subject to revision, erosion, and reinterpretation, and in this reckoning he resists the temptation to rewrite history into a cleaner narrative, choosing instead to accept the contradictions that shaped him, recognizing that ambition can coexist with doubt and conviction with regret, and that the truest form of honesty late in life is not confession for applause but accuracy for peace, a quiet acceptance that the past does not need to be justified in order to be understood. After decades of deflection, careful phrasing, and deliberate ambiguity, the moment arrives not as a dramatic announcement but as a measured acknowledgement, one shaped by age, context, and a sense that the audience is finally ready to hear what has long been implied rather than spoken. And when Henley confirms what many had suspected, he does so without spectacle, framing it not as a revelation meant to shock but as a truth meant to clarify, one that reframes motivations, choices, and silences across his career, revealing that the driving force behind much of his work was never mystery for its own sake but control over narrative, authorship, and meaning. And in articulating this he closes a loop that began decades earlier, allowing the story to align at last with the man who lived it. The response unfolds in waves, as longtime listeners revisit lyrics with renewed attention, critics recalibrate interpretations once taken for granted, and conversations emerge that bridge generations of fans who hear the music differently now that context has shifted. And while some feel validated and others unsettled, the collective reaction underscores the power of delayed truth, proving that art does not remain static even when recordings do. And through this reassessment, Henley's catalog gains new dimensionality, not diminished by explanation but expanded by it, as understanding deepens appreciation for the discipline and restraint that defined his choices, confirming that meaning withheld can sometimes resonate longer than meaning immediately revealed. The film returns to the arena where it began, the final chords fading as the lights soften and the crowd rises not in frenzy but in recognition, and Henley stands once more at the edge of the stage, absorbing a moment that feels complete rather than triumphant, aware that endings do not require finality to be meaningful, and as the applause recedes there is no grand farewell, only the quiet satisfaction of having shaped a life that remained faithful to its core values even as circumstances evolved. And in this closing scene the story settles not on legacy as monument but on continuity as principle, leaving the audience with the understanding that some confirmations arrive late not because they were hidden, but because they needed time to become true. When the amplifiers are powered down and the touring schedules finally loosen their grip, what remains of Don Henley's presence extends far beyond recordings and ticket stubs, living instead in the systems he helped defend and the principles he insisted upon when convenience would have been easier, as his influence quietly embedded itself into conversations about artistic ownership, environmental stewardship, and the obligation of success to protect rather than consume, shaping not only how music is made and preserved but how artists understand their role within a larger cultural ecosystem, and these contributions do not announce themselves with the drama of a hit song yet endure with equal resilience, functioning as frameworks that allow future voices to exist with greater autonomy. And in this way Henley's legacy becomes less about imitation and more about permission, granting space for others to insist on integrity even when the industry pressures compromise, ensuring that his impact survives not through nostalgia alone but through continued resistance to erosion. Viewed in full, Henley's journey mirrors a broader American arc, one that moves from optimism to disillusionment and finally toward measured realism, where belief is tempered by experience but not erased by it, and through decades of shifting cultural tides his work stands as evidence that art need not surrender to extremes of innocence or cynicism, instead occupying a space where reflection becomes a form of endurance. And as aging reframes ambition into stewardship, his story suggests that growing older in public does not require retreat or reinvention so much as alignment, the steady narrowing of focus toward what matters most. And in this closing perspective his life does not offer easy lessons or heroic myths, but a disciplined example of how longevity, when guided by restraint and conscience, can transform a career into a quiet argument for patience, responsibility, and the lasting power of songs that refuse to hurry their truths. If you've enjoyed uncovering the remarkable journey of Don Henley, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more in-depth videos, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that dives deep into the lives of music legends, their secrets, and the truths we've all been waiting to hear.